You're going to die someday. And when you're lying there in your final moments, you won't care about your achievements, your possessions, or what people thought of you. You'll care about one thing. Did I live a meaningful life? Did my existence matter? Was I actually myself? Or did I spend my entire life performing who I thought I should be? Carl Jung spent his career studying what makes life meaningful versus what makes it empty. And he discovered that meaning doesn't come from where most people look for it. Not from success, not from pleasure, not from avoiding pain, not from being good. Meaning comes from 5 specific principles that most people violate their entire lives. Then wonder why nothing feels satisfying. I'm about to share Jung's 5 essential lessons for a meaningful life. Not complex theories, but practical wisdom that will fundamentally change how you approach your existence. These aren't just ideas to understand. They're principles to live by. And if you actually implement them, you'll experience a depth of meaning that success and pleasure could never provide. If you want a life that matters, not to others but to you, these 5 lessons are non-negotiable. Here's what Jung understood that most people never grasp. The modern pursuit of happiness is making people miserable. We're told that meaning comes from achievement, accumulation, pleasure maximization, and pain avoidance. Get the career, find the relationship, make the money, avoid suffering, stay positive. Do these things and you'll have a meaningful life. But Jung observed the opposite. The people most dedicated to this formula were often the most empty. They achieved everything they thought would create meaning and found it created nothing. They avoided all the suffering they thought would destroy them and found that avoidance destroyed their depth. They maximized pleasure and minimized pain and discovered a life so shallow it couldn't sustain them. Because Jung discovered something radical, meaning doesn't come from getting what you want or avoiding what you fear. Meaning comes from becoming psychologically whole, integrating what you've rejected, accepting what you've denied, and living from your authentic self rather than your constructed persona. This requires a completely different approach to life than what culture teaches. It requires violating almost every conventional principle about how to live. And it requires embracing 5 specific lessons that most people spend their entire lives resisting. But here's what Jung promised. If you actually live these 5 lessons, you'll experience meaning that external achievements could never provide. Not happiness necessarily. Meaning is deeper than happiness. But a life that feels substantial, purposeful, and authentically yours. These aren't comfortable lessons, but they're necessary ones. Let's begin. Jung's first lesson. Stop organizing your existence around avoiding suffering. Suffering isn't the enemy of meaning. It's the raw material for it. The meaningful life doesn't eliminate suffering. It transforms suffering into consciousness, depth, and wisdom. Here's what Jung understood that modern culture denies. The pursuit of a pain-free life creates a meaningless life. Not because pain is good, but because consciousness develops through friction with difficulty. When you avoid all suffering, you remain at whatever consciousness level you've reached. You don't develop, you don't deepen, you stay psychologically shallow. Jung called this the enantiodromia of comfort, the principle that excessive comfort transforms into its opposite. When you organize your life around avoiding pain, you create a different kind of pain, the pain of meaninglessness, the pain of a life so protected it never develops depth, the pain of existing without actually living. But here's the shift Jung invites. Suffering becomes meaningful when you stop treating it as something wrong and start treating it as something developmental. Every difficulty you face is your psyche creating the conditions for consciousness to emerge. The loss that breaks your heart is teaching you what matters. The failure that destroys your ego is revealing your authentic self beneath the constructed identity. The crisis that shatters your certainty is forcing you beyond comfortable unconsciousness into uncomfortable consciousness. This doesn't mean seeking suffering or glorifying pain. It means when suffering arrives, and it will, you have a choice. Unconsciously avoid it and repeat it, or consciously engage with it and transform it. One path keeps you stuck in patterns. The other path generates the depth that creates meaning. Think about the suffering you've experienced that actually created meaning in your life. It wasn't the easy times. It was the difficult times you consciously engage with instead of avoiding. The grief that taught you what love actually means. The failure that forced you to question who you thought you were. The betrayal that showed you your own capacity for shadow. The suffering you transformed is what gave your life substance. Jung observed that his patients who lived most meaningfully weren't those who'd suffered least. They were those who'd suffered consciously, who stayed present to their pain rather than numbing it, who allowed their crises to transform them rather than just surviving them, who metabolized their wounds into wisdom rather than leaving them as unprocessed trauma. This is why Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Consciousness requires friction. Meaning requires depth. And depth requires engaging with suffering rather than organizing your entire life around avoiding it. The first lesson for a meaningful life. Stop trying to eliminate all suffering. Start asking what your suffering is trying to teach you. The meaning you're seeking won't be found in comfort. It will be found in what you learn through consciously engaging with difficulty. But understanding suffering's role in meaning leads directly to Jung's second essential lesson. Jung's second lesson. A meaningful life requires you to consciously integrate your shadow, all the qualities you've rejected, denied, and disowned. Because whatever you don't integrate, you'll unconsciously act out. And unconscious action creates chaos, not meaning. Here's the mechanism Jung discovered. From childhood, you learn which qualities are acceptable and which aren't. The acceptable ones become your persona, who you identify with. The unacceptable ones become your shadow, who you reject as not you. But Jung emphasized, rejection doesn't eliminate these qualities. It just makes them unconscious. And unconscious qualities don't disappear. They control you from outside your awareness. Jung called this shadow projection. You see in others what you can't acknowledge in yourself. The selfishness you hate in others is the selfishness you've denied in yourself. The anger you judge in others is the anger you've repressed in yourself. The weakness you despise in others is the weakness you can't accept in yourself. Your strongest reactions reveal your deepest denials. But here's why shadow integration is essential for meaning. When you're unconscious of your shadow, you're not living your life. Your shadow is living it for you. Your denied aggression comes out as passive aggression. Your rejected sexuality emerges as compulsive behavior. Your disowned weakness shows up as overcompensating strength. You think you're making conscious choices, but you're actually being controlled by what you've refused to acknowledge. This creates a life that feels inauthentic because you're not actually living as yourself. You're living as a fragment of yourself, while your shadow runs the show from behind the scenes. Meaning requires wholeness. And wholeness requires integrating everything you are, including what you've rejected. The practice Jung recommended. Notice your strong reactions. What qualities trigger you most in others? What behaviors do you judge most harshly? What aspects of human nature do you find most unacceptable? These reactions are maps to your shadow. Whatever you strongly reject in others is likely what you've denied in yourself. This doesn't mean becoming those qualities. It means acknowledging you contain them. Yes, you have selfishness. Yes, you have aggression. Yes, you have weakness. Yes, you have darkness. Not as much as you've projected onto others, but you have them. And when you can acknowledge them consciously, they stop controlling you unconsciously. Jung emphasized that shadow integration doesn't make you a worse person. It makes you a real person. You stop performing goodness while unconsciously acting out badness. You start choosing consciously because you're aware of all your impulses, not just the acceptable ones. You become authentic instead of just appearing good. This is why Jung said, the goal isn't to be perfect, it's to be whole. Perfect means rejecting half of yourself. Whole means integrating all of yourself, including your shadow. And only wholeness creates the authenticity that makes life feel meaningful. The second lesson for meaning: stop trying to be only good, only strong, only light. Acknowledge your shadow. Integrate your darkness. Accept your full humanity. Because a meaningful life requires being actually yourself, not just performing an idealized version while your shadow sabotages you from the shadows. But shadow integration points toward Jung's third essential lesson about where real meaning actually comes from. Jung's third lesson: you cannot build a meaningful life on external validation, approval, recognition, success, status. These might bring temporary satisfaction, but they'll never create lasting meaning, because meaning comes from internal alignment with your authentic self, not from external confirmation of your persona. Here's what Jung observed. People organize their entire lives around gaining external validation. They choose careers for status, relationships for approval, behaviors for recognition. They're constantly performing for an external audience, measuring their worth by others' reactions. And they're miserable because external validation is inherently unstable. It requires constant performance and provides no lasting satisfaction. Jung called this the tyranny of the persona, living your entire life as a performance for others rather than an expression of yourself. You become so identified with how others see you that you lose contact with who you actually are beneath the performance. Your life becomes about maintaining appearance rather than discovering essence. But here's the shift Jung discovered. Meaning emerges when you stop seeking external validation and start seeking internal alignment. When your actions match your authentic values, not others' expectations. When your life expresses your actual nature, not the persona you've constructed for approval. When you're living from yourself rather than performing for validation. This requires a radical reorientation. You have to stop asking, "What will they think?" and start asking, "Is this authentically me?" You have to stop measuring your worth by external metrics, salary, status, likes, recognition, and start measuring it by internal metrics. Am I living according to my actual values? Am I being authentic? Am I expressing my real nature? Jung emphasized that this doesn't mean ignoring all external feedback or becoming narcissistic. It means you stop organizing your life around getting validation and start organizing it around being yourself. External feedback becomes information, not identity. Others' opinions become perspectives to consider, not truths that determine your worth. Think about the moments in your life that felt most meaningful. Were they the moments when you got the most validation? Or were they the moments when you were most authentically yourself, regardless of others' reactions? When you spoke your truth, even though it wasn't popular? when you chose your values over others' approval, when you lived from your depths rather than performed for the surface. The meaningful moments are always the authentic ones. Not because others validated you, but because you validated yourself by being actually yourself, rather than performing who you thought you should be. This is why Jung said, individuation requires separating from the collective. You have to stop living according to collective expectations and start living according to your individual nature. The collective wants you to conform, to perform, to seek its approval. Your self wants you to differentiate, to authenticate, to become actually yourself. The third lesson for meaning: stop building your life on the unstable foundation of external validation. Stop performing for approval. Start living from internal alignment with your authentic self. Because the meaning you're seeking will never be found in others' opinions of you. It will only be found in your own sense of being genuinely yourself. But this lesson about internal versus external leads directly to one of Jung's most challenging insights. If these lessons are landing, that suffering creates meaning through consciousness development, that shadow integration is essential for authenticity, that external validation can never create lasting meaning. You're beginning to understand Jung's radical approach to a meaningful life. Before we explore the final two lessons about what meaning actually requires, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these final two lessons address the deepest questions about meaning, what you must sacrifice, and what you're actually here to become. Jung's fourth life lesson: you cannot become your authentic self while clinging to who you think you should be. Meaning requires sacrifice, specifically sacrificing your idealized self-image so your actual self can emerge. Here's the psychological trap Jung identified. From early life, you develop an image of who you should be, the ideal version of yourself based on parental expectations, cultural values, religious teachings, and your own fantasies. This idealized self feels like the goal. If you could just become this person, you'd finally be enough. But Jung discovered, your idealized self-image is your greatest obstacle to meaning, because that idealized image is who you think you should be, not who you actually are. And as long as you're trying to become the idealized version, you're preventing the emergence of your authentic version. You're rejecting your actual nature in favor of a fantasy about who you're supposed to be. Jung called this the sacrifice of the ego ideal, the moment when you have to let go of who you think you should be so you can discover who you actually are. This is one of the most difficult psychological transitions because it feels like giving up on being good, being special, being worthy. But it's actually giving up on a fantasy so reality can emerge. Here's what this sacrifice looks like practically. You have to stop trying to be perfectly enlightened and accept that you're human. Stop trying to be endlessly selfless and acknowledge your actual limits. Stop trying to transcend your darkness and integrate it instead. Stop trying to become the ideal person and start being your actual person. Flawed, limited, human, real. This doesn't mean abandoning growth or accepting dysfunction. It means you stop measuring yourself against an impossible ideal and start accepting your actual nature with all its contradictions, limitations, and humanity. You stop trying to be superhuman and start being fully human. Jung observed that people often reach a crisis point where they have to choose: keep pursuing the idealized self and remain fragmented, or sacrifice the ideal and become whole. Most people can't make this sacrifice because it feels like giving up, like settling, like admitting defeat. But Jung would say, you're not giving up on being good. You're giving up on the fantasy that was preventing you from being real. Think about the idealized version of yourself you've been trying to become. The perfectly disciplined person, the endlessly patient parent, the constantly productive professional, the spiritually enlightened being, the strong person who never needs help, the good person who never feels darkness. These ideals might inspire you temporarily, but they ultimately create suffering because you're measuring your actual self against an impossible standard. The sacrifice Jung asks for: let go of the ideal, not to become worse, but to become real. Accept that you're not going to be perfect, enlightened, or ideal. Accept that you're going to be yourself, messy, contradictory, limited, and human. And discover that being actually yourself creates more meaning than trying to become an idealized version ever could. This is why Jung said, the second half of life is about becoming whole, not becoming perfect. Perfect requires rejecting everything that doesn't match the ideal. Whole requires integrating everything you actually are. And only wholeness creates the depth and authenticity that makes life meaningful. The fourth lesson: sacrifice who you think you should be. Stop trying to become your idealized self-image. Accept your actual nature, including its limits, flaws, and darkness. Because meaning comes from being authentically yourself, not from achieving an impossible ideal that requires you to reject half of your humanity. But this sacrifice of the ideal self reveals Jung's final and most essential lesson about meaning. Jung's final lesson contains everything. Your purpose in life isn't to achieve something external, save the world, or become someone special. Your purpose is simply to become yourself, to individuate into the unique expression of consciousness you actually are beneath all conditioning, expectation, and performance. Here's Jung's ultimate insight about meaning. You're not here to fulfill some grand external purpose assigned by fate, God, or society. You're here to complete a very specific internal purpose, becoming consciously what you unconsciously already are. Everything else, your career, relationships, contributions, flows from that primary purpose. But the purpose itself is simply become yourself. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming an individual, undivided, whole, not copying someone else's path, not fulfilling others' expectations, not becoming who culture says you should be, but discovering your unique nature and living from it authentically, regardless of external pressures to conform. This might sound disappointing if you were expecting some cosmic mission, but Jung would say, becoming actually yourself is the hardest and most important work you can do. Because most people never do it. They spend their entire lives being versions of other people, performing their parents' unlived lives, fulfilling culture's expectations, copying admired figures, conforming to collective standards. They die without ever discovering who they actually were beneath all the performance. But here's what makes this purpose meaningful. When you're actually being yourself, everything you do has meaning because it's authentic expression rather than performance. Your work becomes meaningful, not because it's objectively important, but because it genuinely expresses your nature. Your relationships become meaningful, not because you've found the perfect person, but because you're showing up authentically. Your life becomes meaningful, not because you've achieved something impressive, but because you're actually living as yourself. Think about the moments when life felt most meaningful. Were you performing some grand purpose? Or were you simply being authentically yourself? when you spoke from your actual truth, when you created from your genuine nature, when you loved from your real heart rather than your performed role. The meaning wasn't in the achievement, it was in the authenticity. Jung emphasized that this purpose isn't selfish. When you become actually yourself, you contribute something unique that only you can contribute. The world doesn't need more people copying successful templates. It needs actual individuals expressing their unique consciousness. Your individuation doesn't just serve you, it serves the whole by adding something genuinely new, rather than just repeating what already exists. But here's the challenge. Becoming yourself requires going against almost everything you've been taught about what makes life meaningful. You have to stop chasing external achievements as proof of worth. Stop performing for validation. Stop trying to be who you should be. Stop measuring your life by collective standards, and start the much harder work of discovering and expressing who you actually are. This is why Jung said most people are terrified of individuation. It requires standing alone, thinking for yourself, living from your truth regardless of others' approval. It requires psychological courage that achievement doesn't require. You can achieve great things while remaining unconscious, but you can't individuate while remaining unconscious. It's the process of becoming conscious itself. The fifth and final lesson for meaning: your purpose is to become yourself. Stop looking for some external mission to fulfill. Stop trying to prove your worth through achievements. Start the work of discovering who you actually are beneath all conditioning and living from that authentic self. That's the purpose. That's what creates meaning. Nothing more, nothing less. Let me bring Jung's 5 lessons together. Your suffering has meaning. Stop trying to eliminate it and start transforming it into consciousness. You must integrate your shadow. Whatever you reject will control you unconsciously. Meaning comes from within. External validation can never create lasting meaning. You must sacrifice who you think you should be. The idealized self prevents the authentic self from emerging, and your purpose is simply to become yourself. Individuation is the source of all genuine meaning. Jung would say, these 5 lessons violate almost everything modern culture teaches about meaningful life. Culture says, avoid suffering, present only your good side, seek external validation, become your ideal self, and achieve some grand purpose. Jung says, engage with suffering consciously, integrate all of yourself, including your shadow, find meaning internally, sacrifice the ideal to become real, and recognize that becoming yourself is the purpose. The cultural approach creates lives that look impressive but feel empty. Jung's approach creates lives that might not look impressive but feel deeply meaningful, because meaning doesn't come from external achievement. It comes from internal authenticity, wholeness, and conscious living. These aren't easy lessons to live. They require psychological work that most people avoid their entire lives. They require facing what you've been avoiding, accepting what you've been rejecting, and becoming who you actually are, rather than who you're supposed to be. But Jung would say, this work is what makes life meaningful. Without it, you're just performing existence without actually living it. If you want a meaningful life, not just a successful one, not just a comfortable one, but a genuinely meaningful one, these 5 lessons are your map. They won't make life easy, but they'll make life substantial, authentic, and yours. If you want a meaningful life, Jung would tell you, stop looking for meaning in achievements, possessions, or others' opinions. Stop organizing your life around avoiding difficulty and pursuing comfort. Stop performing who you think you should be while your authentic self remains unexpressed. Start engaging with your suffering consciously instead of just trying to eliminate it. Start integrating your shadow instead of projecting it onto others. Start finding your worth internally instead of seeking it externally. Start sacrificing your idealized self-image so your actual self can emerge. And start living your one true purpose, becoming actually yourself. These 5 lessons are simple to understand, but difficult to live, because they require going against almost everything culture teaches you about how to live. They require psychological courage that achievement never demands. They require you to value authenticity over approval, wholeness over perfection, depth over success. But if you actually live these lessons, if you make them your operating principles instead of just ideas you agree with, you'll experience a quality of meaning that external achievement could never provide. Your life will become yours. Not impressive necessarily, but authentic. Not easy, but meaningful. Not perfect, but whole. That's what Jung discovered. Meaning doesn't come from getting what you want. It comes from becoming who you are. Start that work today. That's the only work that actually matters. If you're ready to build a meaningful life using Jung's wisdom, subscribe to this channel. Join thousands learning to live authentically instead of just successfully. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.